And coming to Jamie. So thanks for joining us today, Jamie. And
Cool.
so Jamie is a data engineer, and we brought him on today to talk about some of the stuff he's been up to with regards to predicting fantasy football. And it's, I think, hopefully a really nice way to understand how data can really go to something that's hopefully pretty cool and accessible to talk about. And hopefully we can move some of the conversation on to how it translates to the business as well, which is what we're all here for. So yeah, welcome, Jamie. Great to have you here.
Thanks for inviting me.
That's all. And I think before we start, actually, it's worth calling out that we've got some listeners in the States. So we are talking about soccer today, right? English football.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Just before we go down that rabbit hole. That's awesome. So yeah, do you want to give us a quick 5-minute intro to your background and kind of what you've been up to and what you're doing with this project as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Jamie. I'm a data engineer. Been sort of like working with data for many years in different sort of like forms, from sort of like manufacturing data, which is where I really cut my teeth on it, and that's where I sort of really introduced me to the world of stats and sort of like statistical analysis and what you can actually do with data through various places I've worked in different industries, where I've always tried to apply the same sort of like logic and always try to sort of look at data as a source of insights and a way that you can actually use it to make decision making easier, because you're doing it based on facts rather than opinion. Because one of the biggest problems is everyone's got an opinion, but if you can back it up with facts, it makes life that much easier. So I am a massive advocate of data-driven decision making, and that's one of the reasons why I sort of like started looking at my side project on the football data, and actually used that as a way of learning new technologies as well. So in various places I've worked, I've actually looked at the technologies which we should be using, and then I've used my side project to actually prove what can be done. And I brought that into the business to actually say, why don't we try this? And when you're starting to look at predictions, because very few companies actually start looking at predictive analytics and actually using data to predict what's going to happen, because most of the time everyone's just looking at what happened, and then they're trying to predict what's going to happen based on what they did in the last quarter. So I sort of like wanted to see whether there was some science behind it, and so I sort of like created my side project, which has now been going for probably 12 years.
Oh, wow.
And it's followed me around, and every company I've ever worked in, I sort of like I use every opportunity there is to talk about it. And a lot of people, don't like football or soccer, but it is a case of when they start to see what we're doing with the data, then people start to get interested. So yeah, so that was a very brief intro.
That's really cool. And why fantasy football to begin with? Was it something you've kind of always been interested in, or was it just a topic that you felt you could apply it to nicely?
It's a sport which I believe you can use the data to actually help you. So I started looking at just normal football. So I was just looking at football results and to see if there was something which I could do to help me sort of like predict football results. So in the early days, my big plan was to come up with this tool which I called the predictor, which would basically sort of like give me an edge if I ever wanted to place a bet. And so it was a case of I wanted to see, how the bookie's coming up with the odds. So I just started looking at the data behind it. But the problem with sports data is always a bias, because you're always drawn to certain things. And it was in the early days when I suddenly realized that if you don't remove that bias, your data is never going to be good for decision making. So then I sort of like started seeing how I can look at the data and almost look at the data based on the parameters of what I wanted to, rather than looking at two teams. So rather than looking at Liverpool v Man United, I would look at team A versus team B. And the thing is with football, there's so much data. There's just so much data around it. The squads, time of the match, day of the match, injuries, who the referee is, and it just jumped out at me as a sport which had lots of data, but not too many people actually analysing it.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really cool.
there's often an emotional bias, I guess, with this kind of stuff, especially when it comes to football, such an emotional, passionate sport, and especially with the fan base. So I can imagine that using that data can actually, like you said, taking away that Liverpool Man United factor of it and actually just looking at it as team A, team B, and looking at it from an analytical point of view. as to who's the best team or who comes out stronger is probably the best way to analyze this kind of data. Do you find that your side projects, as you say, or the software that you've created, do you find that it can be adaptable to anything other than just football, or have you built it specifically around just football?
There's two parts to it. The first part, the original part, which was the predictor, and that was based on teams. So it's looking at variables. So any sport which has A versus B, it can be adapted towards. The second part is purely for fantasy football. So that's when I combine the two sets of data and then I just drill down. Because quite often people have asked me, why have I only done it on football? Over the years, I've looked at it from a perspective of, okay, what about cricket? What about rugby? But the problem is these other sports aren't so rich with their data. And there's if you take rugby, for argument's sake, the same teams are going to be successful year in, year out. There's not too much change. So there wasn't much scope to actually see how I could give myself an advantage if I was playing a game, a fancy game or whatever. But it is one of those, I've even looked into some of the American sports. And when you look at the American sports like the NFL, they're doing a lot more than what I'm doing. And they're doing a lot more than what we actually do over here anyway. But yeah, I'm looking at pulling in more data streams and then just seeing how the model performs at a team level.
And where do you get your data streams from then? Is it many different sources, or is it just from one source?
I use quite a few different sources. So for there's, which for the life of me I can't remember the name of it, but there's one website that produces CSV files. So I just get those, and then I use the Premier League APIs. But the problem with the Premier League APIs is they do change them on a quite a frequent basis. And so because you've got no control over it, you spend the first couple of weeks changing, they change the API names, they change the data that's coming back. They generally strip out data because they're sort of like people are actually commercializing what they're doing, and there's other streams which you have to pay for. The data sources are getting narrower and narrower, but there is quite a few different data sources that you can do, and there's some which are paid, there's some that are free. It really depends on sort of like how far you want to go into it.
Right. And do you find there's a difference between the free sources and the paid sources? Is there, in terms of like credibility?
Yes. And also with some of the paid ones, especially with football, where it's a global sport, what will happen is some of the paid ones will give you access to every single league there is, but the free ones will give you access to only one or two leagues from one or two countries, and you're only allowed to do so many calls per day. And it's sort of like, even with the data that I get, there's some feeds which I classify as real-time data, but real-time-ish, because I run the feeds every 15 minutes, but most of them I only run a couple of times a week anyway.
And what's the difference between running sort of real-time data and doing it, say, weekly, for instance?
When I started looking at the APIs that were coming from the Premier League, basically what will happen is, because they work in a game week, so what will happen is players will get points only when they play, so that's only a game week. But there's activities that happen, especially with fantasy football, where you need to transfer players in and out. So what will happen is, in a game week, they will have total transferred in and total transferred out. So in any game week, you can see how popular a player is. But the problem is that's an accumulative number throughout the whole week. So when I was doing my real-time-ish, what I wanted to do was actually see what was happening on a smaller basis, to actually see if I can use that to give me an advantage. Because one of the things that happens with when players get transferred in and out, that forms their transfer value. So players can go up and down based on a couple of other things, but transfers is one of them. So what I would do is I have a API, I have a Python job that goes to the API and brings the data down. I put it into a SQL database every 15 minutes, and then I just look at the numbers in that 15-minute window, and that's that gives me a number of what's been happening in that 15 minutes. And then I could just aggregate it up throughout the day, so I can see what players are hot and which players are cold throughout the day, and then I can determine whether I want to transfer them in before their prices go up, or wait to see what happens, because if there's an international friendly, for argument's sake, you may transfer someone in to get the best price and then they get injured and then you've lost that advantage. So it's basically just trying to use any source of data you can to give you the slightest advantage.
Yeah, definitely. And with the transfer windows, because from my understanding of when I've played fantasy Premier Leagues and stuff like that, obviously there's a period of a transfer window that you can have before the games and stuff like that. So do you find that the best data to sort of use is almost immediately after that game on Sunday where it's closed off for the week and then transfers reopen? Or is there a specific time basically when this data is like most valuable?
At this moment in time, I have not got a definitive answer to that, and I tried different tactics. So sometimes I transfer literally. What I would do is I will have my list of transfers for the next 4 or 5 weeks, because you're looking at the fixtures and you're looking at the difficulties in those fixtures, and you're looking for other things that's happening, like international break. So sometimes I will do it as soon as the game week is closed off. Then I will transfer them that. The problem you got with early transfers is if they have got a game, whether it's a European game or an international, then they could get injured. But if the advantage of doing it early is any price increases, doesn't catch you out. So at this moment in time, it's sort of like there's many schools of thought, and this is where Twitter is great as well, because some people say transfer early, some people say transfer late. I just find that I will transfer when I feel it's right. So I will just look at the data, I'll monitor the data, I'll look at what's happening. If you look at this transfer this sort of like international break, for argument's sake, what's happened is so many players have been injured and they've got COVID, so it's really thrown everything into array.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. How's COVID affected the data then, from usual, basically?
Or you can actually now. I don't think COVID's affected the data apart from the fact of when a player gets it. I think if you look at the first part of last season up to lockdown, so March, then when they resumed, if you look at the form pre-lockdown and post-lockdown, there was definitely a downturn in clean sheets so defenders and goalkeepers will get less, more goals being scored. Even at the start of this year, they was getting record amounts of goals. Yeah. Now, I still think that the fans play a bigger part than what a lot of people give it credit for. And so I think what's happening is if you're a big club, if you're playing at Anfield, you've got a crowd behind you. If you're not a top 6 side and you go there, the crowd's going to get on your back. So that could have an adverse effect on the players. With no crowd, it's almost like a friendly. So it's almost like evened it out. Hence why, if you look at it this year, everyone is beating everyone. So it's sort of like it's played havoc with the data from the perspective of there's other things to take into consideration because there is no crowds. Technically, it's a case of you can't really say, well, this game, they're definitely going to win.
And is that I heard you said Anfield then, so I presume you're a Liverpool fan, right?
I am.
Good man. And I'm guessing, so do you think that your data can factor in sort of like the emotional response that the crowds can give, for instance? I mean, I know obviously it can't, to a certain extent, it can't factor in like the amount of emotion and drive it will give an individual player, but maybe over a period of time when, for instance, Liverpool play in front of Anfield and in front of a crowd like the Kop, and they've won periodically at Anfield over, I can't remember how many games now, like they had a winning streak, didn't they? Like
it's crazy,
games. Yeah. You know, maybe that data can get factored in. Is that something that you can take on board?
Yeah, there's definitely a home and away, or there was up until COVID. There was definitely a home and away split, not so much this season, and I believe it's the crowds that's causing that. But it was one of those things that another piece of data which I've started to collect, but it's slightly more manual because it's not in any feeds, is the actual crowd sizes. So that would just give me another variable to work with. So then I will have sort of like the day of the game, the time of the game, the crowd, the referee. So it's different things that I can actually put in there. So it's creating the ever longer variable list that we can look at to try and get a more favorable outcome by looking at the data.
It's crazy.
What do you do when there's a period like this where we've got COVID now, and obviously this year's been pretty strange in terms of the stats, I guess, that's coming out of it. What do you do about taking that data going forward? Would you use that data set, or would it kind of throw things off and you'd probably throw it away, or would you use something like the crowd size to factor that in? How would you tend to like work that into the future?
You would, once this is over, then I could go back and actually analyze it in more detail. But we would actually use it to see what effect it really did have on it. Now, one of the effects it's having is where there's more games in a shorter period of time, you're starting to get more injuries. So what it's doing is all of a sudden you're seeing data sets growing based on the fact that injuries are becoming more prevalent. And even with the technically, with the fantasy football, because when you collect that data, they will tell you whether someone's playing or not, and they will give you the reason. So you would get a reason by sort of like saying, he's injured because he's got a muscle strain, but now he's not playing because he's in self-isolation. So it's starting to enrich the data so that you can actually start looking at it. But with the data, whenever we're looking at it, I even though I've got the full data set over many years, it's sort of like I try to narrow it down as well to look at it. So when we're looking at form, we may only look at the last 4 to 6 games, home or away, to actually see how players are doing. If you take this season for argument's sake, and you take Spurs, and like with Harry Kane and Son, if you look at Son, he's sort of like, those two are the top 2 scorers, but it's a large proportion of Son's points have come away from home rather than at home. So it's sort of like, it's when you start looking at the data, it's starting to throw things in that you wouldn't otherwise expect it, because you would expect home points to be more than away points, and then you'd also sort of like start to see certain players not doing so well in such a short space of time, when it is a case of, for every sort of like for 3 or 4 away games on the trot, some was doing really well. But then that's really contentious, because when you start looking over the home and away form, it's a case of that is very temporary. That's something you can't prove over a large period of time.
Do you find that you can see patterns within this data for different players or for different teams? Is there any like usual patterns within rise and dip of form, for instance, or anything like that?
There is certain patterns, but it's almost like it's like over the last couple of years, over the last 2 seasons, 2 players that spring to mind is 2 seasons ago when Solskjaer first came in, and then Pogba really started playing well. And last year when they bought Bruno, he did really well when he first came in. So the difference between those was, one was a new manager, one was a new player in the team. So it was a case of, you're starting to see things like influences which are affecting a player, which have, going back to the Pogba, there's the new manager bounce, which everyone sort of like says, is it true, is it not? Same group of players, they play well. In a short period of time, they do very well, but then they drift off, and then their long-term stats are pretty much the same as what they would have been. But you could get a short advantage by, when a new manager comes in, picking a player from that team where he's coming in, because for some unknown reason they play out their skins. So there is certain patterns, but it's trying to sort of like, you generally see it after the second game week, based on the fact that all of a sudden he's doing well.
I'm guessing these kind of patterns as well can almost predict a mentality of a player. I mean, you're never going to be able to fully say what type of mentality each player has, but I mean, I guess this kind of data can help understand that mentality of each individual player anyway. Can you kind of see that from these patterns?
With what I'm starting to do is look at additional data sources outside to see if that has an effect on the players. So not just looking at the football data. So for argument's sake, if you look at it in the news at the moment, where you've got Rashford, how much of that is giving him a lift or not? But he's quite up and down in his performances anyway. So we're starting to look at getting feeds from Twitter and seeing what the sentiment is for these players based on the non-football activities as well as the football activities, to see if we can actually draw a pattern from that, to see if outside influences are actually affecting their in-game play. it's one of those things. Once you start looking at it and you start looking at what data you can get, and being sort of like, as I always say to people, I built a whole solution all on my own. So it's a full end-to-end solution, and it's one of those things that with any software solution, it takes some time to actually create it. And so I've got a backlog as long as my arm of stuff I want to put in there, but it's just a case of having the time to actually see when I can do it, because the more variables, the bigger the data set, the more data points, the more accurate the insights are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm guessing this is one of those things that can just continue to grow and grow and grow, and you can bring in so many different sources of data to analyze every sort of like section of football, and every sort of game, and how every player interacts, and etc. Do you use any sort of AI technology at all to help you with the processing of this?
No, we had some not AI, but there was some sort of like some predictive stuff that we was using within Python to actually see if we can take all these variables and output either a predicted score or the likelihood that they were going to do well. In fantasy football, you've got the XG and XA, which is expected goals and expected assists, which everyone really looks at, because that's and the fact is, like, these companies that come out of XG and XA, they are getting the premium APIs from, or the really good stats websites, and so they're getting the players' movements on the pitch, and they're sort of like seeing where they were on the pitch when they took a shot, and then that feeds into their XG and XA. That's way beyond what I've got at the moment, but we did come up with a couple of different predictive Python algorithms to actually see if we can predict the likelihoods of how many points a player would score based on the variables that we had.
That's amazing. That's really cool. It's just so much data to think about. It's incredible the level that some of these go to, I guess. You said you've been doing this for 12 years now. Was it 12 years? Was that right?
Yes, probably over 12 years.
That's amazing. I mean, has it evolved much in that time? Has it just been a case of getting more data on top, or has the kind of software underneath changed along the way as well?
It's evolved massively. If I think back to 12 years ago when I first started looking at it, it was simply using Excel, and I would just fill in stuff on an Excel spreadsheet and see what it would give me. Because I worked at Motorola for 16 years, and they devised Six Sigma, and so they were very much into their statistical analysis. So they were very much a company that was sort of like driven by the fact that the more data you have, the better you can be at your insights, and the more successful you could be. So that's why I really first started looking at it. So the first iteration was literally just an Excel spreadsheet. Then I moved on to Access databases, because then I could build myself a little front end where I can input stuff into, and then I sort of like moved into the world of SQL Server, and then at one point I was using integration services to extract the data, but again I was using flat files, and then we was putting that into analysis services cubes, and I had reporting services sat on the front end. That was good fun, taught me a lot, and again the progression in the technology was based on where I was going with my career, and then at one point I sort of like I removed all the analysis services stuff because I believed that was just too much for what I needed, and then it was just using SQL Server databases, still using integration services. Then I replaced integration services with Python to use for my ETL processes. It was on the cloud for about a year and a bit. So built a solution in Azure. So I was using sort of like VMs, again, using Python on VMs and SQL Server databases, and then that would just run in the background. And currently where it is, I'm back on Python and SQL Server as just the main two parts. But I am currently in the process, and Power BI is the front end. Power BI is the visualization tool, as you've seen the other week. So it's come quite a way, and it's sort of like a lot of that is based on the fact that I wanted to learn the technology. So I used the side project as a way of learning the new technology in a safe environment, because if I messed it up, I only messed my own stuff up, which really sort of like allowed me to sort of like experiment more.
That's really cool. And how much did the kind of cloud stuff, how much was was that benefit to what you were doing? I mean, you said you've moved off it now. Was there reasons for moving off? Was it just cost or?
Yeah, the company I was working for at the time, we were creating a e-commerce website, so I had an MSDN license, so I had like £150 a month to spend on Azure, and they said I could spend what I wanted. They said you could do what you like because it was my subscription. So hence why it allowed me to sort of like explore more about sort of like VMs and PASDBs, functions, logic apps, stream analytics. So, and strangely enough, uh, I actually built a solution for one of the companies I was working for in Azure based on what I built with my football data. So I'd used all the same components to actually, and that was a real-time data collection system. So I used exactly the same components, but obviously I was just looking at a different place. So it really enabled me to actually learn a skill and use a skill.
Yeah, what a great way to do it. Absolutely. So one thing I wanted to ask Jamie was, I hear this thing a lot about, obviously correlation doesn't necessarily translate to causation. Is that right? Have I got that right around?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
is that I guess you must see that in some of the data you're looking at. How much of that is a factor, and is it easy to spot without knowing kind of what you're looking at and knowing the domain of football as well as you do?
I think it's a case of you can use that to put the narrative of what you want to produce. So it's one of those things that it's it's a bit like when they say sort of like, there's more shark attacks when they're selling more ice creams on the beach, and it's sort of like you can use that as a way of giving your narrative the edge in what you're saying. So it's one of those, you've always got to be careful of it, and it is quite easy to be caught out by it. But it's one of those that when we're looking at the data, this is when we're looking at it, and this is where football's quite hard because there's so many variables and so many things that can affect something, that you're sort of like, you almost sort of like saying, right, well, okay, if I change a variable, what would the outcome be? So it's almost like you're testing your data based on the fact that you want to make sure that the correct information is there. And sometimes it is a case of, like I'll use Liverpool as an example, only because they're particularly bad in defence at the moment, and it's one of those, they're conceding loads of goals. Is it because Van Dijk is injured? And most people say, yeah, that's definitely what's happening. But if you look at the latter part of last season, they were conceding all the time, and that was that was post-COVID. So it was a case of, well, actually, is the fact that Van Dijk not being in defence causing the major issue? Was it the fact there's no fans that's causing the issue? So it's one of those, and it's then you can create sort of like, and this is when I was saying earlier about Twitter, why Twitter's a wonderful place for sort of like putting whatever you want on there, and you could create a following based on your narrative. So you can say, right, okay, well, Van Dijk's not playing, so Liverpool's going to do really bad in defence. So everyone starts selling Liverpool assets. He comes back, but the thing is, that's not going to change it, because there's something else which is causing it, because they were bad when he was there. And so it's one of those. I'm forever checking the data and seeing if there's something else which could be giving me the true story, so that the insights that I'm getting out are giving me an advantage, rather than what I'm believing is almost like what everyone else is saying.
Do you find social media quite a credible data source then?
There's two, I would say there's two main types of people on social media, and I love social media. I love Twitter for the football stuff. But you see a lot of accounts where they go ITK, which is in the know. So what will happen is they will sort of like, on a Thursday or Friday, you will get these ITK accounts which will basically say, oh, such and such isn't playing this weekend. So what happens is everyone gets rid of that player, buys another player in. Guess what? That's not true. So there's the two types of people, are the ones that really want to help people, and then there's the ones that really want to scupper people. So it's one of those that I take it with a pinch of salt. There is some really good accounts, by the way. There's some absolutely fantastic ones which are really credible, and they're really, really useful. But there is a lot of people that almost want to trip people up.
Yeah, I can imagine so. It's almost that sort of Wikipedia approach, isn't it? Like, you don't quite know what you're getting, whether it's true or not. But I can imagine, again, like with anything though, it's sort of testing that data from that source to see if it is credible, and then if it is, to continue to use it, and then I guess you can get that sort of trusted.
Yeah, because at one point I was collecting data from Twitter when I was in Azure, because I could do it on a regular basis, and so I was using it to create sentiment analysis based on players or what people were saying, but I could never get it to really give me anything which was solid. So I decided that was one data source that I wasn't going to use at that moment in time. I will revisit it, but what I wanted to do was try and build up some type of credibility rating as well as a sentiment analysis, so you can see who's saying what, and to see whether, because you could see what they were saying before it happened and then what happened, and then you could basically come out of a credibility rating based on the fact that 90% of what this person was saying didn't come true, so I'm not going to listen to them, or 90% of this did come true, so I can listen to it. So again, it's just expanding the data set to actually make it better. It's a bit, it's a bit like when people, these hot tips of horse racing, how many of them are really sort of like hot tips?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you find there's any, or are there any data sources that you're sort of interested in exploring that you haven't done yet? Like, do you think that is there anything that's like kind of top of your list that you really want to start using or start exploring about how credible it is and how useful that data would be?
The social media, this is something I really want to go back and revisit, because I think that could really sort of like lend itself to some good information, because if there's, and it goes back to credibility, if one person is saying something, the chances are it may or may not be true. If you've got 1,000 people saying something, the chances are that it's more likely to be true. So using the power of the crowd. So I definitely want to revisit that and sort of like see what I can gain from it. There's other things as well. There is like the weather data. I've been going back and forth with the weather data for quite a while, because I do believe that plays a part. But again, I haven't been able to prove it or disprove it yet. So that's definitely another area where I looked at the data for a while, but I want to go back. But the freebie APIs from the weather people are not brilliant. So it's a case of weighing up to see whether I do want to actually start paying for some of these APIs, and sort of like how much it would cost against what I'm getting out of it. Because if it's not too expensive, then it's worth paying.
I'm quite interested in how the transfer window and transfers have an effect on this sort of data, and how it's used, and sort of actually the end result of because obviously using it for a fantasy Premier League, for instance, and doing your transfers and stuff. So how does the transfer window affect that? Do you find much difference within like the data coming in, and can you measure, for instance, from social media? I know there's a few accounts who have that information beforehand. So does that kind of factor into your data, or is it just as and when the player comes in?
It's the players. So within my data model, the players are the equivalent of a slowly changing dimension. So what will happen is, most of the year, a player will just have a single entry into a table because they're a single team. But if you look at if players move either after the season started or in January, in the January transfer window, they would have 2 entries. So what I can actually start seeing is what they did before against what they did after. So there's certain players which they've definitely, there's 2 players that spring to mind which have definitely improved from moving to those other teams, and the stats back that up. But again, another thing to consider is where they're going from and to in relation to what's happening with that team at that moment in time. So the January transfer window, you generally find that the players are almost brought in as a panic buy, if you like. Whereas players that are brought in at the start of the season are more likely to have been brought in because there's been a long-term future for them. That's still not saying, because sometimes they will buy a player who can't be released until January. So that's different than just buying a player in January because you've got an injury crisis. So you generally do see a change in the data based on certain types of players, and again, it depends on whether the positions that they're going into. And sometimes it's a case of a player will be bought from one to the other, but they will be played out of position. So the data sort of like gives them a slightly inflated points total based on where they are because they're playing further forward, for argument's sake.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm from I don't know. I'm just as an example, Diogo Jota, for instance, last season at Wolves. I mean, everybody could see he was a good player. I don't know if your data ever showed that he was probably a good player. Like from a statistical analysis, they were. And I know that Liverpool actually use that model of statistical analysis for their transfer. So I know he had good stats beforehand, but coming into, say, a better team with players who have higher stats around him, do you find that you often see those stats become elevated when those players come into that new team?
With the Jota, that was quite an interesting one because it was going to be a case of he was brought in to be the fourth player in the front three. So it was always going to be, from a Premiership perspective, he was always going to get less game time than the front three, but he's been brought in for the long term because of his age. He just so happens to have actually lit up Europe. And so he's because he's in a team with better players, he's playing better. And the stats are, there's two things which I do when I'm looking at the fantasy football is the eye test and the stats test. So when you look at the eye test, the problem with some eye tests is like with Jota, you're looking at the European games, not the Premier League. So what's happening is you're basically sort of like saying, well, actually his stats are not as good as someone else. But when you see him play, you think, well, he's that much better. So it's one of those where you're sort of like, you're combining what you're seeing against what you're seeing on paper. So and then it's a case of his price is lower, so he's worth bringing in because he will get game time. He won't get full matches, but then his points per million is going to be that much better because when he does come in, he does score. So that's one example of when you're actually, if you just went by the stats, you could miss out. I'm
also kind of thinking about I don't know, like Chicharito back in the day for Man United, that super sub sort of thing, goals per game time, for instance, like maybe him playing for a full game time. So if someone else was injured and he plays for that full game time, he didn't get as many goals as when he was brought on as that super sub for the last 10 minutes. He was scoring more goals. So do you often see your data throwing out that kind of those kind of like patterns as well?
You can see those patterns because it's one of those things that what I do is because you get the bonus point system within Fantasy League, what I would actually do, we monitor the bonus points against the non-bonus points. So the fact is, if a player plays 60 minutes, they're going to get bonus points. So super subs are they're going to lose out in certain areas, but not in others. So then it's a case of, well, actually, it's their price range becomes the pinch point of whether you're going to go for it. Because it's one of those where if you've got a player that comes on and it's very explosive, he may be worth having in certain fixtures. So then you would look at the fixture difficulty where you can actually say, well, he's not going to start because this is their best starting lineup, which they always start with. So then you're starting to look at the minutes that the players are having. And then you're sort of like saying, well, actually in these fixtures, I believe he's going to come on. So the game could be tight, and that's why he's going to come on. So then you would pick him. So it's a combination of sort of like you're looking at the points, you're looking at the bonus point system, you're looking at how many goals he's scoring, how many assists he's getting for what he's getting. So when we look at some of the data which I look at is almost like the player form. Now with the player form, that goes down into the data a lot lower, because if you look at headline figures, you would always choose the same players week in, week out. And the problem is with the data, I say the problem is with the data, it's the problem with how you can interpret the data is if someone's on 100 points and the next person's on 70, that person that's on 100 points could have a lot of bad games before that person is on the 70 is going to hit him. So again, when I look at the data, not only do I look at the headline figures, I also look at the sort of like I almost like window my data to say, right, okay, what did he do in the last 4 game weeks? What did he do in the previous 4 game weeks? So you've got a rolling window where you can actually start to see what people are doing. And stuff like super subs and stuff like that come into it. And because there's, I've got any player that's owned by less than 3%, I classify as a differential. And that's sort of like one of those sort of like rules in fantasy football, the unwritten rule. And again, now what you generally find, the players that are subs are generally in that 3%. So then it will be a case of some like Chikorita, you would actually look at, is he a differential? Who are United going to be playing? Is he worth getting in? Because sometimes you need that difference.
Cool. I mean, there's many different fancy Premier Leagues out there. So do you find, and I find that often their pricing structure is different, and how they work is different. Do you find that your model fits all of them, or is it just one particular fantasy Premier League?
It really only fits the fantasy Premier League at the moment. When there was a group of us that were that created a league in the Premier League last year, and when the Premier League stopped, one of them said, "Let's go and join the Bundesliga." So we went in the Bundesliga, and that is run totally different. In the fact you could change your captain mid-game week as long as you hadn't played. So the problem is the rules that apply are different. Now, with the actual way that the data comes in, they're all done on game weeks. So in one respect, it does fit them all, but the way you use the data and interpret and play the game will be different because the rules are different. And so it's the fact is that some leagues, they will give you points based on accuracy of passing, how many interceptions you did. So they're more complex. The Premier League I think it's a lot of people say it's not the best, but I think it's probably for where it is, I think it gives me the most enjoyment, and it's probably one of the biggest out there because it's got over 7.5 million global players, but it just fits in that area where there's loads of data, and the fact is that it's easy to play, the rules are quite straightforward, there's a great community out there, so I've not really tried to fit what I've got with other leagues.
Cool. So obviously you follow, the whole point the data is based around is the Premier League. But then do you factor in the fact that some of these teams within the Premier League and the players within the Premier League also play international friendlies, will also play Champions League, Europa League, FA Cup, Carabao Cup?
So
how do you track that?
I literally just manually input the games which were played so that I can actually, because it's like, that old adage that teams that play in Europa League always do bad the following weekend. So I'm just recording what teams have played when and what type of competition it's in. And the thing is, because I track, even though the data which I collect for fantasy football is only on the Premier League, I collect data from about 20 leagues globally. And the good thing with tracking at least 20 leagues globally is European leagues. When I start putting in the data for European competitions, that gives me how those other teams are doing. Now, with the real football, which are being tracked from 20 different leagues, I'm only looking at the headline figures. So what was the score? I do keep like home team, away team, half-time score, full-time score, obviously, half-time result, full-time result. But there's also data from I think there's about 10 different bookmakers on what odds they give that match. So I can actually look at what the bookmakers were offering against the actual results to actually see their accuracy, which then that helps me look at the teams which are most likely to do well based on historical data. And then that feeds down into when I'm playing the fantasy football, because then I can actually start saying these are the teams which I need to watch out for. Anyone that watches any form of Premier League will know that it's probably only 7 or 8 teams that you're going to pick most of your players from anyway. The rest of them is a little bit hit and miss.
Yeah, definitely. You'll probably get 1 or 2 of the old players that someone might pick, and they get lucky. Generally, I think what was my one last week? I think it was Pookie from Norwich.
Yeah,
who just came in and scored a ton of goals from day one. I know he was good in the Championship. Do you ever factor that in then? Like players coming through from the Championship, if they've done well, will they do well into the Premier League, or is it just something that, as soon as that player comes from the Championship into the Premier League, that that it's kind of just like new player data?
it's new player data from the perspective of what we're getting, but I do record some data from when I was in the championship based on what they've got. I also do it at a team level. So again, because I've got 20 leagues worth of data from the last 30 years. So if we just look at the Premier League, that enables me to actually look at when a team comes up, how well do they do against other teams, and when do they start to drop off? If they do drop off, some teams are just bad from the start. So not only we are looking at the new team data, but also the players that are coming up. Hence why I went for Patrick Bamford from game week 1, because he had a great season last season.
Yeah.
But the reason I do that is not so much for fantasy football, but it was when I was building a predictor tool. I was looking at if you was going to place a bet, when should you place a bet? And again, it goes back to my days from working in Motorola with statistical analysis. So I'd look at the outliers, and I came up with, and I'm sort of readjust it every year. I believe the outliers in the Premiership are the first 6 and the last 6 games of the season, which gives you 26 games, which is more predictable than the other 12. The reason being, teams coming up generally have got a slight advantage than other teams because they may have brought in new players, which means those teams are slightly different, which means that the Premiership teams from the previous season that are playing them, it takes them a little bit of time to get used to them. And also the first 6 games of the season, player fitness isn't so great. After 6 games, and players are sort of like at their peak fitness, really. Could be slightly more than that. And then at the end of the season, a lot of things have already been decided. So the only teams that are really fighting for the ones in the relegation zone. So you start to get results which you wouldn't expect. So the last 6 games of the season, if I was going to place a bet, I would probably look at games which you wouldn't expect because they're more likely to come up with a weird result. But even if you look at like this season, for argument's sake, if you look at, Liverpool have conceded 7, City conceded 5, and that's in that first window, but they conceded against teams that hadn't come up. But it's still that there's the data is not just telling me things from a player perspective and from a team perspective, but it's also giving me a time perspective. So it's basically highlighting the fact there is outliers, so watch out for them because they will catch you out. Mind you, if I would have put Liverpool getting beat 7-2 by Aston Villa, I'd probably be a rich man by now.
Yeah, painful that.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that this year is actually probably quite interesting from a data analysis point of view because it's so different from every other year. And I think obviously COVID has a massive part to play in that. And like you said, it's not COVID, it's the crowd not actually being at the game and not having a presence at the game. It's almost like that home away advantage has been taken away. Have you found that? And have you found that your data's like almost completely changed compared to all the other years? You could probably, I don't know, for instance, you could probably guess, if a team came to Anfield like Aston Villa, for instance, hopefully they'll get beaten 4-5-0.
Yeah.
But now it's kind of like that home and away feeling's been taken away. You don't have Anfield, you don't have the Kop. When you Old Trafford, for instance, you don't have the crowd there. So I can imagine that data is now changing quite a lot from what you're seeing.
Yeah, because you would normally put a higher weighting on a home team. But this season, if you look at the first few games of the season, it was the away teams had the advantage. And it was almost... when you watch them on TV, it's got that, you watch a game of football, it's like watching a friendly. There's no crowd. The artificial noise is abysmal.
Yeah.
And so if you don't watch it with the artificial noise where you can hear the players, it's almost like got that, I'm watching a friendly. So I'm not sure if that actually is relayed onto the players. And so it's a fact is that rather than being really sort of like, absolutely buzzing to play a home game in front of your home supporters, they're not there. So it really sort of like levels the field, and that has been shown where the home advantage hasn't been there.
There's so many factors, aren't there? And I guess I would imagine part of the 12 years you've been working on this has just been understanding, like looking at the data and like taking all these factors in. There's just so much to think about from the sounds of it.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, because the thing is with football data is you never get to a point where it's perfect, because football, every season, things change. the squads change, managers change. And so it's the fact is, just when you think you got to a point where you think, right, this is really going to work now, something happens and then something else changes. And the thing with fantasy football, you never see the same people winning it year after year after year. You see the same people in the sort of like top 1%, but it's the fact is that there is just so much to take into account. And I think that's the problem. And everything that you take into account will change because teams change, and football is quite cyclic, because it is a case of a team will start at the top for quite a while, and then they will start to get worse as their manager and their players get older, and then there'll be the new kids on the block. And at the moment, I think football's great because everyone is beating everyone. And and you look how good Spurs are, you look at how good Man City are, you look how good Liverpool are. There's almost like a riches of teams, and so it's not just like when Arsenal and Man United was winning everything. United predominantly.
Yeah, absolutely. How have you found the evolution of software over the past 12? Because I know you brushed on this earlier, like you started out in Excel and now you're here. I mean, I feel like within the last 5 years, especially, like software is just booming, especially all this sort of freemium software that we're getting at the moment as well. And there must be like a sheer quantity of coming in, and then, it's going to evolve more and more where AI is going to get more involved. How do you see that impacting your solution that you have at the moment? Do you see it making it better in a way, or different in any way?
I think it would definitely be better. But I think it's not just the software, and because I think it's the thing is that, like we're using things like Python, it's free to use, and there's a big community out there, and it's people start sharing ideas with each other. And this is where the social media becomes really good, because then people do start to share information, and you can make whatever you've got good, because it is one of those things. It's sort of like, there is the prestige of doing well in the fantasy league, but it's the fact is that, it's not like you're going to win millions. And so people will collaborate. And it's when I talk to different people about it and what I'm doing, they sort of like say, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? So I think the software is becoming easier to use. There's better packages out there, like with Python, for argument's sake, you use VS Code or PyCharm. There's more things to share. There's loads of things on GitHub where people are sharing, they're making their stuff accessible. So it's becoming more and more collaborative. And the thing is with football in the data science world is, teams are now, professional football clubs are starting to employ, data analysts, data scientists. And so it's becoming more prevalent in the fact that the more data you have, the more you can do. But I think it is a case of also the more data you have, you can flood yourself with too much data, and then you start to have data which isn't meaningful.
I mean, do you think that the importance of kind of data engineering, data science is being realized by companies at the moment? Is that trend starting to take hold now?
I still don't think companies are using data correctly. So if I go back to when I started at Motorola back in the early 90s, everything was measured, but it was measured to actually get some insights from it. So we wouldn't just be measuring for the sake of measuring. We would know what we wanted to do. We wanted to use that data to become more efficient. And so we sort of like started using statistical process control, whereby, your higher and lower limits would change based on what was going through. Because if you had one item being made and it failed, then it would just be a case of that would be 100% failure. But that's not a true 100% failure in such. It's just the numbers are so low. And I think it's a case of companies over the years, they just collect data, but I don't think they're collecting it to say they're collecting it. They're not collecting it to actually say we are collecting this data because of. And so I think that's why there's just however long ago it was, 10 years ago, everyone had to have a data lake. So Hadoop was massive. So it's it wasn't the case of what you was collecting, it was how much you were collecting. So people were just, petabytes of data, but why? It's because you were collecting petabytes of data. I think there's sort of like, it's that data literacy to actually look at what you're collecting to actually see what it's going to tell you. And that's, I think, the difference between data-driven companies and data companies that are not driven by their insights. So I think we're coming to an interesting time, and I think it's with, over recent years when the new job titles come out, like with data engineers, data scientists, and it's a case of being a data engineer. One of the problems you've got is that I need to move data from here to here so that someone else could do something with it. But it's a case of I need to understand what they're going to do with it so that I can produce the best data set for them. So when they come to do it, it minimizes their time because they don't want to be doing any form of data engineering. So I think you end up with silos where you end up with, a data engineer will do something and then pass it over, rather than working in the horizontal work stream, whereby, you put together a team of people to go and get some data, to move the data, transform the data, visualize the data. If you work in the horizontal where everyone understands what they're doing and why they're doing it, it then becomes a really good data-driven insight.
Yeah, that's some really good insight, actually, because I mean, you see a lot of these jobs floating around at the moment, like you say, with data science being the hot topic at the moment. But yeah, I think it's probably still being reserved for the large companies, isn't it? Or the ones that are, like you say, truly kind of data driven at their core. Yeah, it'll be an interesting few years to see how that plays out, I guess. Cool. So I think we'll probably end up wrapping things up here. Anything else you wanted to cover off, Jamie, before we close down for today?
No, I think we've covered it all off. I hope that was insightful. I hope you got something out of it.
Totally. I mean, a super interesting project. It's and it's really good to see how data can be used on something that's really accessible and easy for a lot of us to understand as well. But it sounds like a ton of work's gone into it, and yeah, really interesting to see where that goes over the next 12 years as well. Because that's really cool.
Yeah, it's one thing I will say, because it's sort of like when I'm speaking to people and they're sort of like, and just touching on what you just said about data scientists and stuff like that, it's when I speak to people and they want to make their next step in their career, and they're sort of like, they're saying, oh, I want to learn the cloud. Well, why don't you go and learn the cloud? Well, I don't know what to do in it. Then you say, well, do a side project. I was saying, if you just do a learning course on Azure, for argument's sake, you are just going to be doing something which is out of a textbook, and it may or may not interest you. But if you actually read that textbook and then you do a side project, and I always say to people, if you do something like sentiment analysis in Twitter, you will then learn to sort of like how to work with APIs, how to actually consume data from APIs, how to get data from those APIs and put into a data source. You could use SQL Server, you could use Postgres, you could use Cosmos DB, and then you would learn how to visualize that data, and it gives you you start to build a full appreciation to what data is and how you can use it. And that's why I sort of like, people are amazed that I spent 12 years working on my side project, but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for my side project, because it's enabled me to actually show people. And it's amazing how many interviews I've been in and my side project has come up. And in certain instances, I've been in an interview and they've sort of like said, so, they do the normal questions, and then they sort of like say to you, yeah, you can answer these questions, but can you really do it? And because most of the time I've always got my laptop on, I've been in interviews and I've said I've done something, and they've sort of said, can we see it? So I said, yeah, and I've actually gone through it there in the interview. So it's sort of like, it's been a really useful tool to actually not just learn the technology, but show you can actually use it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think so many of these projects, I know in the past I've struggled with side projects, back in the days when it sometimes seems like there's no point to what you're creating, but like you say, some of the point, or most of the point, should just be to learn something new potentially, and like that should be a good enough reason just to go and grab something off the shelf and use it. It's a good reason to pursue it for sure. That's awesome. Where can people find out more about you, Jamie, if they want to? Where's the best place to catch you?
Probably LinkedIn, actually, because it's sort of like I'm not as active as I would like to on Twitter, and I'm just sort of like relaunching my blog. So I would just sort of like say probably LinkedIn, and most of the stuff which I talk about and my football stuff I end up putting on LinkedIn. So yeah, that's probably the best place they can find me.
Fantastic. Well, if any of our audience are interested in the project, and it definitely sounds like an interesting one, then yeah, please do catch Jamie on there. And as always, thanks for listening today. Thanks so much to you, Jamie. It's been a pleasure hearing about what you've been up to. And yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much.
Brilliant. Cheers, Jamie.
All right. Thanks for that, Len.
See ya.
Bye for now.